Welcome to the Writing with Purpose podcast, inspiring readers, writers, and nature lovers to embrace creativity and nature connection for positive well-being. I'm your host, Anna Williscroft. Join me for heartfelt conversations about transformational journeys and practical tips with fellow writers, journaling guides, and outdoor enthusiasts. Discover how writing, reading, and nature connection can help you find clarity, spark creativity, and live a more fulfilling life. Whether you're a seasoned writer, a curious beginner, or simply someone seeking a deeper connection to life, this podcast is for you. It's wonderful to have you here today. In this episode of the Writing with Purpose podcast, I'm joined by Nic Wilson, garden country diarist, BBC Gardener's World writer, and author of Land Beneath the Waves. In our conversation, Nic shares themes from her debut book and how nature became her refuge as a child when her mother lived with chronic illness. Decades later, when facing her own health challenges, embracing local wildlife and nearby nature became profound sources of belonging and creative inspiration for Nic when the wider world felt out of reach. If nature connection and health pose challenges for you, then this episode provides inspiration and plentiful ideas. Hello! This morning I'm here with Nic Wilson, a writer, an editor, a Guardian country diarist, and a BBC Gardener's World magazine writer specialising in wildlife and wild plants. Nic, welcome to the Writing with Purpose podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're more than welcome. It's great. So, Nic, you live in North Hertfordshire, which you have done for the past 22 years. You grew up in Cheshire from a little place which is not far from me actually here, about 10, 15 miles away. And you've also lived in Durham. So you've experienced these three areas, and this is something that you say writing, reading and nature has helped to very much be part of your process in developing a sense of belonging, which I love, because I think where we live, the places where we live, where we visit or where we aspire to really help to shape us in many ways, don't they?
Yeah, definitely. I think we live in a very global world, don't we? Which is great in a lot of ways, but I think it's easy to lose the local in that,
Yeah.
particularly when you don't have a family, necessarily lived in a long place, in the same place for a long time, or you yourself have moved around a lot. And I think particularly if you end up in a situation like I did, like many people do, where you're at home for, long periods of time, whether that's because you've got children or because you're not terribly well, as I wasn't for a while, and that kind of thing. I think it certainly helped me to feel that I was developing a relationship with the place where I lived. I think that can be really important.
Yeah, and to use a metaphor, the kind of planting those seeds and growing those roots to where
Mm.
you are. And I think, yeah, there's a lot of times when you sort of hear things and people, they talk about other places where they want to be, almost as though the grass is greener on the other side, whereas they do really forget to have a look, what's right on their doorstep. And I think we do that a lot. Certainly here, close to the Peak District, there's a lot of National Trust places, and there's so many places, just little green spaces behind the housing estates, or, the little
Yeah.
pathways in between the houses that, just, there are other places to explore, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, nearby nature is one of the things that really gets me excited. I think paradoxically, if you're forced to stay in a place, and for, a period of time you can't go elsewhere, or for some people, that might be a much longer period of time, then it forces you. In my case, I wanted to kind of see birds and look at plants. And so it kind of forced me to do that where I was, which actually then opened up a whole new world for me. In a lot of ways, that was a real sort of broadening of my horizons, even though I was in quite a narrow space, I suppose.
Yeah, definitely. And also, how much joy that brought to you.
Yeah, for sure. I think it two types of joy, two levels, I suppose. One is experiencing it myself and researching it, and then the other one is writing about it and sharing it with other people in the hope that they then can find those things themselves and benefit from that themselves.
Yeah, and there's so many layers to what you've just said there, you experiencing it for yourself, learning, enjoying it at the time. And then there's the second stage of you writing about it and
Mm.
reliving some of that and delving a little bit deeper into it. And then getting to the point where you share that with other people. And then, knowing that you're a part of their journey and them learning and then thinking, oh, wow, I didn't realize
Mm.
that. Or,
Mm.
oh, now I'm
Mm.
going to have a look for that. And yeah, it's just sort of, it's that whole kind of, I was going to say circle of life. I don't know if that's the right phrase to use, but yeah, when you look at it in that way, there's so many layers to it and rich layers as well.
Yeah, and I think when you find something interesting and meaningful, not just to me on a personal level, but at a societal level, in the wider sort of biodiversity and environmental areas, I think sharing it, or if it's exciting information, sharing it, I find it difficult not to share it because I want everybody to, be excited by it. But then also, I suppose there's a sort of, I feel a slight vocational element to what I do because it's a message that I feel is really important and that, a lot of people are very committed to, but that's a small number in society as a whole. And so,
Mm.
the more of us there are shouting about it, the more voices there are, the more likelihood that, people in general take notice, I suppose.
Yeah, for sure. Starting a movement.
Well, it's carrying on a movement that's been there for a long time, I think, isn't it? And you're trying to amplify it whenever you can.
Yeah, for sure. So, Nick, you've got nearly 30 years of writing experience under your belt, including academia, education, journalism, and narrative nonfiction. Your debut book, Land Beneath the Waves, which is a memoir published by Summersdale in June this year. So, congratulations. There we go. There it is. And there's a copy on your bookshelf as well that I can see behind you. So, we'll delve into that shortly. But first of all, I have a couple of a quick fire round questions for you. So, what was the last book that you read, Nick, and how did it influence your perspective on the relationship between landscape or healing or landscape and healing?
So the last book I read was by Tom Cox, who's a writer I hadn't read before, and it's called Ring the Hill, I think it was, back on my bookshelf now. And yeah, I saw Tom, he was involved in the whole debacle with Unbound, and he was selling books through Blue Skies. I bought one of his and I really, really enjoyed it. So I'll definitely be reading more of his stuff. I think it was interesting to get another person who's writing about kind of landscape and stories to do with landscape, but there's quite a lot of comedy in there, quite a lot of humour,
Mm.
which surprisingly to me was something that came out of my book. It wasn't intentional. People have said to me in other kind of interviews, how did you plan the humour in your book? And I was like, well, I didn't. It was, I was quite gratified when people started reading it saying, oh, it's quite funny in places. So I was like, okay.
Mm.
So, I like that element of it, but I think with Tom's book, it's what appealed to me and what, I kind of, what spoke to me in it was the fact that he's walking around his local area and like me, finding stories in there. So it is kind of a collection of different stories of different places he's been, and places he's lived and how that's affected his life and that sort of thing. So I think that
Yeah.
was just a really lovely, a really lovely book to read that was about his experiences in nature and in landscape.
Yeah. And I think you mainly mentioned about the comedy. I think inevitably that sort of thing comes through because it's your personality when you're thinking back
Yeah.
on
Yeah, but I
things.
didn't
And
realise I was at all funny. I think I've just got quite a dry sense of humour, an ironic sense of humour. And I think in our family we're quite off the wall. We're very much into well, my husband and my children are very much into sci-fi and fantasy, but also into Douglas Adams and all that sort of stuff. So clearly some of that's rubbed off on me over the years.
yeah, yeah. No, it's good as well not to be too serious about certain things, particularly when we come to health and mental health and
Well,
you
yeah,
know,
there are dark bits in my book. I'm glad that it's not.
yes.
Yeah, I'm glad that people have said when they've responded, got back to me having read it, that there have been parts where they've been laughing out loud, and then parts where they've been crying, and they've kind of been near each other in the book. And I think in a lot of ways that's a
Yeah.
good thing.
Yeah, I think even just thinking about when you're starting to go into your mum's childhood a little bit and what's happened to her at school, and then when she'd first moved, and I think was there a sentence in there about your dad first seeing her backside?
That's just my dad. My dad. I'm just writing down what he says.
But yeah, have you got a summer read?
Loads of summer reads actually. I've got Michael Warren's Cuckoo's Lee, which I've kind of just started. That's come out fairly recently. I think that was a week before or after mine. And that's about landscape and place and the naming of place, bird
Mm.
names that are in place. So that would be really interesting. I'm hoping we might be able to do a talk together next year sometime. And I've got Nicola Chester's new book, which will be out at the end of September to read, Ghosts of the Farm. So yeah, I'm reading an early copy of that, so that'll be exciting. So yeah, quite a lot of things.
Yeah.
I've got about 8 or 9 on my Kindle, I think, to hopefully
Wow.
enjoy
Avid
along the
reader.
way. But yeah, when I
Yeah.
can, when I get the time.
Yeah, it's rewarding, isn't it, if you can find the time for it.
Well, it's
Lovely,
so
thank you.
important when you're writing as well. I think I didn't write anything really significant until 4 or 5 years ago when I started this book. But as an English student and then an English teacher for 12 years, I spent a lifetime reading basically. And I think I mean, I'm not the first person to say it. Many people say it, don't they? But if you want to write, the key thing to do to start with is read. And for me, it wasn't until I was about 45 that I suddenly felt I had something to say in terms of writing. I'd
Yeah.
done lots of writing, lots of resources for students and essays, on other writers in journals and things like that. Come this book, I kind of thought, no, actually, I've got something I really want to say now, and I found narrative non-fiction as well because I don't know that I was ever particularly meant to be a fiction writer. So, as a young person, I'd spent a lot of time adapting things and writing things as plays, and it was always taking information and then kind of rehashing it in different ways that I ended up doing. But it wasn't really until my mid-40s that I kind of came across narrative non-fiction and thought, oh, actually, this is me. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they say everyone's got a book in them, but what does that book look like, and who's it going to speak to, and what parts of life does it include, or is it a complete
Yeah.
fantasy or reimagining of something? And I love these books where somebody's, they've gone to a museum, for example, or they've visited somewhere and they've locked onto an artifact or a place, or maybe they've even heard of somebody, centuries ago, and then they take that as the snippet that then just weaves these magical tales then of,
Mm.
yeah, I find it fascinating, and where that inspiration comes from for
Yeah.
people as
Yeah.
well. So what was your favorite childhood story, Nick? And
Well, it's funny that I was thinking about that because I go through quite a few in my book. Each there are three kind of main sections in my book. It starts with Cheshire, as you mentioned, then I talk about my decade in Durham where I was studying and teaching, and then Hertfordshire in the last 20 odd years. And each one of those three sections has a children's fiction book, a children's literature book that goes with it, that was really kind of influential to me, either as a child, a young person, or as an older adult in those areas. It links into the stories that I have there. But I don't think it would be any of those if you're asking me about my favourite, although I loved all three of them. I think my favourite book as a child was definitely Lord of the Rings, which I read for the first
ah,
time when I was 11 and then read every year, I think, after that. And I think it was just the scope of the imagination in it, the scope of the landscape, I suppose, as well, because I don't think I was aware of it until sort of fairly recently. But when I look back over the reading that I did and what I enjoyed, mostly literature in this case, it tends to be to do with nature and landscape, all of it.
mm,
I don't think I was aware of that pull at the time. And I do love fantasy, although I don't tend to read as much these days because I'm reading other things. So I think,
mm,
yeah, I think that was just so magical and so much
yeah,
imaginative scope in it that I probably enjoyed that most. But the three in my book are The Weird Stone of Bridsingham by Ellen Garner, which, as you know, is set not far from where you are and where I was brought up. And the middle one is The Windeye by Robert Westall, which is about Cuthbert and Lindisfarne and Durham. So that was something I taught when I was up there to my year sevens, my first group of year sevens. So that was trying, I think, without being aware of it, to sort of get them to connect with landscape and the stories around where they were, the same way I had with Weirton and Brisingham. And then in North Hertfordshire, the story is Terry Pratchett's The Wee Free Men, which is about Tiffany, who's a chalk witch, and all the other witches. It's one of his children's books, but as we know, all good children's books, they're
yeah,
extremely good for anybody of any age. And yeah, that's all about her, how she derives power from chalk, because most witches can't be witches on sedimentary rock. They have to be on hard stuff like granite, but she's got the power to be a witch and pull kind of strength from the timeless, depths of this landscape, the bedrock, which is obviously the chalk, which was made up by marine creatures at the bottom of the shallow seas that were here in the Cretaceous period. And I think for me, as an adult, that very much spoke. Well, I didn't read it as a child. I only read it when my son started to read the books. Those particular Pratchetts, I'd read the other ones when I was younger. So that was something I came to while I was living here. But also, it really spoke to me because I was in a place where initially I hadn't felt like I belonged. I'd felt very northern when I moved down here. And actually, the time I've spent here with the plants and animals and learning about the landscape has really reinforced how important the chalk is, because obviously the pH of the land and the chalk streams and everything hugely affects the kind of botany we have, the sort of flora we have in this area, and that then affects the invertebrates and it affects larger animals. So it's really bedded into the wildlife and the stories here. And so by the end of the book, I've kind of gone down through the layers to the bedrock, both in a sort of physical sense with the landscape here, but also in a metaphorical sense in terms of trying to work out who I am as somebody who lives with a chronic illness.
yeah. And that's a lot that you've gotten out of the books in that sense. Yeah, just, we read certain things and, there's a lot of learning in there as well. Coming back to, noticing those small things and going down those alleyways and in those streets and the gardens and, noticing those little things that are
Mm.
close by if we can't necessarily explore even wider. And just picking out those little things out of the books as well, that there is actually, depth to them. There's research gone into things, which, particularly if it's fiction as well as,
Mhm.
non-fiction, that there's so much enrichment there for us to draw from.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, absolutely.
everywhere.
All three of those books and many others, obviously, but all three of those, particularly in terms of landscape, have real core stories, don't they? That they've then used as imaginative springboards, I suppose. So you've got the kind of folk tales in Moberly of the wizard and all the horses in Winston of Brissingham. You've obviously got the real life story about Cuthbert becoming the Bishop of Lindisfarne, and then his body when he died was taken round the northwest and ended up in Durham, and that's how Durham was set up. And then you've obviously got the sort of the geology of the chalk and everything here. So yeah, absolutely, they're all bedded into real facts. I love it when yeah, I love it when genres are kind of collide, I suppose. I like working on the margins of things, both physically in terms of writing about snippets and things like that. Ways between houses and where the cultivated and horticultural plants come out into the wilder space and the wilder plants, go into the cultivated space. So it's all that mingling in joining places. And I think I write in the book at one point, kind of as a younger person doing my A levels, I didn't really know whether to do sciences or arts. And
Mm.
so I was doing half and half really at that point. I mean, one of the lovely things about the nature writing I do now is that I get to combine both the two things I love, which is
Yes.
words and nature. But, I don't feel we should have to. I think kind of central genres and central subjects are privileged, and I don't think they necessarily need to be. I think it's really
Mm.
important to look at where things join. So, for example, one key join that I think we're realizing how important it is where the environment and scientific studies kind of come in contact with stories and with poetry and music, and in terms of bringing information to people, in society as a whole. Not everybody is going to want to read a scientific paper. So it's how do you communicate those ideas in a way that really gets people's imaginations and really makes those stories part of their lives and part of what's important to them.
Yeah, really helps to
So
connect with them. A lot of the academia and the
yeah.
research side, there's a level of language that's used that the majority of people don't speak that level of language. They can't
Mm,
interpret that level of language. So yes, blending things down and not blending things out, blending things together and
mm,
just making it a little bit more accessible for in layman's terms, but while we're learning at the same time is important. And I think typically traditional genres or categories. You're either this or you're either that, but it's not black and white. There's a lot of greys and there's a lot of hues in between, and more so now, which is a good thing. I think
yes.
there's a lot more that's crossing over and merging together, which just makes it, again, I'll use the word, it's more enriched. It's a richer piece.
Well, it brings in lots more viewpoints, doesn't it?
Mm,
And which is going to include more people. And I think definitely my teaching background has influenced not just the desire to pass on information, but the desire to make it as accessible as possible to everybody. Because I suppose I taught in secondary schools and then in sixth forms, but I taught a wide variety of students from different backgrounds and with different interests. And I think it's really important that we value everybody for what they can bring to the table, and that equally we make the things that we're involved in as accessible in lots of different ways to lots of different people, because everybody should be able to have access to information and to landscape and all the rest of it. So
mm,
yeah, I like that breaking down boundaries thing in my writing. I like playing
yeah.
about with fact and fiction. I mean, when I do it in my book, it's obvious because, like, I turn into a chalk stream, which clearly I haven't. I think it's fairly obvious where those boundaries are. But I think one of the things with living with chronic illness is that when you can't get out, you know, tired physically. In my case, I'm tired physically, but mentally, I'm still most of the time pretty active. So, imagination is where it goes, I suppose, or
Mm.
research into things. Unfortunately, I don't really suffer from brain fog very much or anything like that, as I know my mum does. So, So yeah, so I need things to keep me mentally going, and one of those is researching, the various people around here that were looking at the landscape and the wildlife 100, 200 years ago, reading about that I enjoy. But the other one is sort of, yeah, just going off on imaginative flights, really, which when I write them down, people may or may not come with me, I don't know. But I have fun anyway.
Yeah, again, it's you having that fun, isn't it? And if people can go with you at the same time afterwards, then great. So yeah, we've talked quite a little bit actually about, breaking down those boundaries and making things more accessible for people. And I love in your book how vivid you sort of set the scene, kind of going back a little bit, how vivid you set the scene for your own memories. And the flowers and the weeds and the landscape are always there. And you use sensory language as well, which I think, as a reader, you really connect to those sensory details because you can see it in your mind's eye, the sort of smells that you talk about as well. And you also mentioned about, sorry, you bring in there what friends and family have mentioned that you can't
Mm,
remember.
yeah.
And I love the phrase that you use, the term etch a sketch me.
That's a bit of a joke in our house. You shake me and I've forgotten what you just
And
said.
you've forgotten. But I relate to that so much. There's this real blanks in my childhood, right the way up through to adulthood. But it's amazing what you remember, and it is some of those smaller things. So as I was reading parts of your story, I was thinking about what I remember, such as sitting at the kitchen table and sketching and writing about whales for a school project. But then, I wouldn't remember, I hardly remember any holidays or anything like that we took, or, anything that we did as a family in those holiday periods. And yet little random things like that come back
Yeah,
to us. And it's
yeah.
just fascinating what we remember and what we don't. I mean, can you take us back to your earliest memory of the natural world and offering something that you couldn't find elsewhere?
Well, I mean, I have the very first chapter is called Bombweed and is about the raised bay willow herb that was in my original garden, which is the only memory I have of the first 7 years, I think, pretty much of my life. So, as you say, I did interview a lot of family members. I used a lot of medical records and diaries and journals and photos and stuff to try and fill in those blanks. But I think it would be the garden that we moved to when I was 7.5 in Cuddington in Cheshire, because it was somewhere I spent a lot of time, I suppose. And I remember that. I talk about going up the Scots Pine, climbing the Scots Pine at the bottom of the garden, and the swing and my dad's vegetable patch. And, so that's quite vivid in my memory, much more so than the inside of the house. And I think I don't have a terribly good memory because I take after my dad, who just don't, I think comes from a line of people who don't remember things terribly well. But for some reason, the two of us both seem to remember birds and plants. Well, I remember plants. Dad remembers birds and moths. I'm not quite sure why. Clearly, there's something slightly interesting in our brains. But I suppose for me, places where I've been happier, are things that stick. Um, and so, yeah, I definitely felt safe out in the garden. I think I say at one point, my dad used to go out in the garden as a place to escape. And so, I was quite like him and I just sort of followed what he did, really. So,
Yeah,
yeah. And I think
yeah.
also, I think when you're writing, one of the things I do in writing workshops with people, and when I'm doing nature writing, the first thing I do is to get them to close their eyes, the group, and we smell some things and we talk about them. So I think it really is important to bring a scene alive, particularly when you're writing about wildlife and landscape through senses other than the visual.
Yeah.
And actually, that was easy for me as a child because I don't remember what the flowers looked like, but I remember what they smelled like.
Mm.
It's sensory, points that I could quite easily pick up on for the book.
Yeah, and there's so much from being outside, and as a childhood. I
Yeah.
suppose the other side to you say that you don't remember much inside, and I don't either. Thinking about it very much, apart from possibly the smells of cooking. My mum always makes, well, still does, makes everything from scratch pretty much. So, there's always herbs, or even if it's just the smell of gravy or a chicken or something like that in the oven. That kind of, and it's very homely smells as well. And I
Yeah.
think I don't know if I'm right in saying this. You perhaps correct me. Vision is sort of the primary sense, but it isn't smell the second one. Not necessarily
Could well
healing.
be. I don't know. I
Hearing.
know. I know that it's got a very close link to memory, hasn't it?
Hmm.
So, But yeah, could well be. I know, and a lot of animals obviously have got far more honed sensitive smells. I
Yes.
suspect we've got better sensitive smells than we use. I suspect that's true of all of our senses,
Mm.
except for sight, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I think you can kind of train in inverted commas yourself, or at least, pay attention to things other than sight and kind of, yeah, be more aware with those other senses. Uh,
Yeah, I would agree with that because I think a lot of our modern day living now, and there's a lot of sight focused things in our lives with technology.
mm,
So that's kind of thrust in front of us, excuse the pun. Whereas being outside, there's just so much more available to us, and
yeah.
we don't even need our eyes open to be able to enjoy being outdoors, I think. Do you think, obviously with what you do in work now, a lot of it is nature writing, plants, wild plants, and the memoir. But do you think that was there a time? I mean, I would say that most people lose that connection with nature, maybe late
Mm,
teens, maybe
mm,
for perhaps a decade, maybe more in some instances, and then we come back to that.
mm.
Would you say that you were that as well, or have you always had that close
I think I've
connection?
always had that, to be honest.
Mm,
I mean, I think I've refound it. I've dedicated more time and more attention to it recently. So I think it's richer in my life now. Whereas when I was teaching, you're very busy and you're inside as an English teacher all the time. So I was less able to access that. When I went back through my diaries, sort of from my 20s and early 30s, I didn't really keep a diary. I kept a journal and it was a bird journal. And
mm,
it's on the shelf over there. It just recorded all the walks we went on and all the birds that we saw. So, I think we were still going out when I could then. It was still important to me. But I don't think I was as aware of how important it was and why it was so important.
mm. Yeah. Yeah, I think these sorts of things, when we get a little bit older, we start to appreciate them more and ask more questions.
Mm.
Whereas when we're younger, it's almost taken as a bit of a given that, all of these trees and flowers and birds and everything's just outside. But then we start to question things a little bit more and, oh, why? And how did that come about? And, why are these particular plants and hedgerows growing in this area and yet this is completely bare in another area, and it's only when we start to pay attention to that we can ask those questions that it becomes more live for us.
I think that's certainly true of our generation. I'm not sure if that's so true of the generation that are growing up now, though, because certainly for any of them who are aware of, the issues that we're all facing, I don't think they had that, they're having that comfort period that we had as children, perhaps.
Mm,
I remember when I write about the outside being this sense of security and regularity and the ongoing timetable. I don't feel like that about it now because obviously
yeah.
that's not the case so much. I feel yeah, one of the many things that I feel guilty for in the young people of today is that they perhaps if they are, engaged with wildlife and the landscape, that they're much more aware of the issues right from the beginning.
Mm.
And I think that can make things a lot harder, can't it?
Yeah, it can. I know we quite often watch the David Attenborough programs, which I
Mm,
always find
mm,
super interesting. But the statistics that he mentions, the facts about how much we've lost certain
yeah.
species in a very relatively small space of time
Yeah,
as
well, within
well.
our lifetime, most of it, I think a lot of the
Yeah.
case studies are sort of from about 1970 to 2020, aren't they? Or they're, that sort of
Mm,
50-year period. So that's sort of almost exactly 5 years off my lifespan, my lifetime, really. And yeah, we've lost huge amounts, haven't we?
huge amounts.
Huge
Yeah.
percentages of
Mm,
everything, really, of all the biomass. So I think,
yeah.
yeah, I'm not sure that all young people kind of have that sense of not really thinking about it and just seeing it as something outside that, is there and is reliable anymore because I don't think they have that luxury, do they?
Yeah, it's a period of time now where we need to reverse a lot of that. I've been noticing, which is it's quite a good thing this year, how many extra flies I have on my windscreen when I drive somewhere. So having them hovering in between the trees, which I
Mm.
don't. Is it something that I'm more aware of now? No, I don't think so because I've been outdoors a lot more in the last 5 years or so.
It's been a very
But
good year, certainly for butterflies, I would imagine for invertebrates as a whole. And I think that's down to the weather we've had. But the big question, there was an article, was it yesterday, I think, in The Guardian about butterflies and the numbers and that. Obviously, they had a terrible year, the worst year on record, I think, last year. And, the thing is, it fluctuates, but what we need is several good years
Yeah.
in order to really secure that and make that a positive thing other than just an anomaly. And the question, of course, is with our varying weathers, will we get that? So, I mean,
Mm.
it's a good starting point. It's better than having another terrible year, but I think that needs to, continue for quite a while for it to have a really big impact positively on population numbers.
Yeah, for sure. So there's quite a powerful moment in your book when you realise your affinity with the wild began as a way to handle growing up with your mother's illness. And you start to introduce that by talking about her as a child and some of the accidents and things that she had. And then and it was actually quite fascinating to see to read within that as well. Again, you explaining how much times have changed since sort of 1960 through to now, and it's not a huge amount of time, but how just society in general has changed. But when did you first kind of make that connection consciously that nature was perhaps providing you that sort of escapism or that way to deal with what was happening?
Yeah, I don't think until I started writing the book, to be honest.
Mm,
It started as a collection of stories about the local wild, about
mm,
landscape and about the plants that I was finding, and the stories, particularly in Hitchin, about what seed banks had been in these old pathways that used to be the old field pathways, and what they told us about, what the landscape used to be like around here, and what we'd lost, and all those sort of things. And it wasn't until I tried to put them together as a book and realised they didn't really cohere as a set of stories, or not as anything that would be of interest, I didn't think, to, well, for starters, to publishers, but also to anybody other than people local to here wanting to read local stories. And I didn't want that. I wanted them to be kind of every path stories, stories that then pointed other people to going looking for these things. So I realised I needed to talk about myself and why they were so important to me, and the bringing chronic illness. That kind of snowballed and it became obvious it was going to be a memoir, and then that was all really quite hard, and that was how it ended up. So it wasn't really until I started that process of thinking, well, why is the local wild important to me? And that obviously then pointed back to my childhood and what had happened, with my mum, that I started to think about, the role, I suppose, that wildlife had played in all of our lives and still plays today, and the
yeah.
importance of that. So yeah, it's not something I'd ever really consciously thought about before, I suppose.
Yeah, and then when we look back, you see how much these experiences have interweaved and shaped how we
Mm.
are today and what we do
Mm.
today. You mentioned as well about looking back on your journal, and your words were "can open worms everywhere,"
Yeah.
which another metaphor again, it kind of just explains a lot. And I think journaling, because I do a lot of journaling and I teach different ways of
Mm.
journaling
Mm.
techniques, that we can, it's something that we start off very simple, or we get a prompt, or we just start to write about something, can indeed open those can of
Mm.
worms. And then we start to
Mm.
think, well, where did that come from? And,
Mm.
how can that then, how can I take that and move that forward and maybe make some changes or some better decisions or something like that? So I think keeping a journal that, you mentioned, you referred to
Mm.
the in diaries and things when creating this
Mm.
memoir and putting it all together, it's an important part of being
Yeah.
able to capture those things in
Yeah.
life.
Yeah, so I went back to the two journals I'd written as a child, which I started when I was about 11, I think, although I didn't write them every day. And that was really interesting to pick bits out of that. And then I've been writing a journal as an adult, a fuller journal rather than just a bird journal for the last, I don't know, 7 or 8 years, I suppose. In fact, the one I've got at the moment's really cool because I found, um, so this is British Birds and Their Haunts.
Oh, that looks like
All
quite an old book.
an old book, but it's from a company that refit them. So it's on presumably the pages were damaged, and so it was then
Oh,
filled with blank pages. So that's now my journal.
oh, what a super idea.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. That it's got
Yeah,
kind of bird of prey on the front. So yeah.
yeah, nice green color as well. You've got
Mm.
plenty of pages in there to keep you
Well,
going for a
yeah,
long
it's a bit
time.
scary actually. It's about 4 times the size of my normal journals, but I did like the idea of writing in British birds and their haunts.
Yeah. Do you do doodles or do you draw? So, when if you
I
with the
don't.
birds. So,
I do draw, but I don't do doodles in my. I keep the two quite separate. So, because I did a diploma in garden design, so I draw quite a lot of plants and things like that. This is just a doodle, very quick one, but that sort of thing.
yeah.
And I can do technical drawings and stuff like that, but I tend to do that and watercolors as well. But I tend to do those separately.
Hmm.
I think when I'm in a writing mood. it's just writing. Occasionally there are little doodles of birds and stuff, but yeah, not very often. It's normally just
Yeah.
words that come out. I think it's for me, it's more that words have always been the way I've been creative. So
Mm,
that's natural to me. So if I sit
mm,
down, I'm not necessarily writing a lot or I'm writing anything particularly profound, but it will all come out in words and I'll play about with words. Art and things has been something that I've done more recently. So
mm.
it doesn't tend to be part of that sort of instinctive creativity. It's something that I kind of sit down and do separately. But I know for a
Yeah.
lot of people, the art is very much part of what they're doing. It's just for me, I think I translate a scene in words first and foremost.
Yeah, yeah, I'm the same as well. I'm also quite linear in the way that I write things. And I went last weekend. I was just looking for. It's not in this room. I went to a journal, planner, and stationery fest.
That sounds expensive.
It wasn't too bad. I can't remember what I paid for the ticket, but
Oh
there was
no, I was
lunch
thinking about what you might
included, and
buy when you were there.
well, I got a, I'll show you this. I did get a specific journal bag.
Wow.
So it's got quite a lot of sections inside that you can put books in, uh, and with your pens and different paraphernalia. But what surprised me about this particular event was how many people use the planners and the journals and decorate them with borders and different stickers and all sort of washi tape I was introduced to, which I've
Yeah, my
not
daughter does
never
that.
used before. And I just thought I need to get a little bit more creative with what I'm doing, particularly if I'm sort of doing, working in my journal and I'm using prompts because I'm trying to, future think or trying to get a little bit deeper with something rather than just it being an account of what's happened in the day or maybe working through a bit of a problem or something. Because some of the examples of journals that people had were just stunning. There was one point where we could share our journals if we wanted to, and I felt a little bit awkward sharing mine because it was just a green leather-bound journal. They got four books inside for different purposes. But apart from reusing this, which is a coloured
Mm.
Bic pen, there's nothing very creative in there at all.
I started a bit like that and I started journaling quite a few years ago, but then didn't do, then got busy. And so I started kind of doing bits
Mm,
of illustrations in there and it was all quite pretty. I was playing around
nice.
with leaves and some birds on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then that takes quite a lot of time. And what I really want to do is write words. So
Yeah.
yeah, then as the book goes on, and then I've got four or five more since then, you get less and less of the drawings and more of the
More of
words.
the writing. Yeah. Because you're
As I
honing
as
in
I
on what you.
found I found more imaginative space in words and decided that was very much where I was going. Uh,
Yeah.
it just depends what sort of creativity, you want to do, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
what's meaningful and productive for you. And for me, that's words every time.
Yeah.
Yeah, playing about with all the different ones. And I mean, that's one of the lovely things about writing the country diary is that it's about 350, 360 words. And I always end up with more. And I always have loads of lists of interesting words I want to use, interesting facts and stuff. And then it's a case of kind of like doing a jigsaw almost, putting it together in a way that fits the word count and gets the information, scientific information over, but also kind of tells a story that has some kind of beginning and some kind of end. And I love that crafting. And I'd far rather sit and craft something like that than draw a picture, even though I enjoy drawing the pictures. So because I've only got a certain amount of time, I do the word crafting. I never get
Yeah.
around to doing the pictures generally.
Yeah. What you need at the time or what project you're working on at the time. And that's a good place for me to ask actually, because you mentioned the garden diaries. Um, is would you because you've done a lot in the past with writing. So how would you say that your connection with nature has changed when you've found yourself in a different perhaps career position with your writing? So before the memoir, so writing for the Gardeners magazine, being the country diarist, how has that sort of shaped your connection at the time or
I think it's given me more time to spend, enjoying it and developing it for sure. Yeah, I suppose the way that I see the landscape now is completely through the language, whereas it might not have been before. But I wouldn't have said it changed particularly. It's just made it even better, really.
yeah.
Just enriched it.
Yeah, and like you say, it gives you the excuse almost
Yeah,
to spend more
absolutely. I
time.
think I say that in the book, actually. Yeah. I mean, it's taken two things in my life that have always been absolutely fundamental to who I was, which is being out in nature and creating things with words or reading words and thinking about how they work. And it's enabled me to fuse them. which is just
Mm.
amazing. It kind of feels like this is where I was always meant to be. I was a teacher and I loved teaching and I would do it again if I had the time over. But I always knew it wasn't what I was going to do ultimately, and I never quite knew where I was going to end up. And the answer I think I've found is that I was meant to be a nature writer. I mean, I still want to go back and do some tutoring and stuff like that, but this feels just like I've settled where I needed to be, which up to
Mm.
sort of 4 or 5 years ago hadn't. I loved doing the garden design, I loved doing the garden writing, but again, it didn't feel quite me. And then, get to the nature writing and the garden wildlife writing and that sort of thing, and that just feels perfect fit.
Yeah. So maybe the tutoring could be teaching people ways of how to do that for themselves.
Yeah, I'd like to be a sort of life writer stroke, nature writer, do tutoring for unis. And I mean, I'm already doing quite a lot of courses. I run nature writing courses for the wildlife trusts and garden writing courses for the Botanic Garden in Cambridge, and I've got one or two other places. Hopefully I'll be starting doing that fairly soon. So, and I
Mm.
really love that because it's great being a writer because you have all this when you can carve it out in your day anyway, when you're not dealing with emails from schools and things like that for your kids and all the rest of it. But when you've got the space, you're obviously writing and you're by yourself and you're able to kind of completely immerse yourself in that creative space. But I do miss not being with people as well, because although I'm
Mm.
an introvert, I did really enjoy the teaching because it's, as I say, it's that verbal passing on of information rather than just doing it purely through words on a page. So
Yeah.
I definitely like to be involved in that over the next
Yeah.
few years.
It's that connection as well.
Yeah,
It's a
yeah.
different kind of connection for connection with nature, but it's still connection with other beings as
And
such.
you learn so much from it as well. You learn so much from other
Yeah.
people, even when they're, students or participants in a course. You're all learning from each other. Particularly, I think when it's adults that
Mm.
you're working with. Although I learned a lot from my students when they were kids as well. So,
So do you do with the courses and with the talks, do you do a mixture of those online? And the Wildlife Trust, for example, are they always on one of their sites?
so I do them for the Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire site at Paxton, which is in Cambridge. I've not done any online for them. I do the ones for the Hertfordshire and Middlesex Wildlife Trust mostly here. I did one for the Sussex Wildlife Trust a few years ago that was online, and that was it was for everybody, but it was aimed particularly at people perhaps who had chronic illness or energy limiting conditions and that sort of things. That's why it's online. I did one for the Festival of Nature for Bath and Bristol. That was online. That was a few months ago. So it's a mix really.
Mm.
Cambridge Botanic Garden ones are in person, but there might be one or two online ones coming up. And certainly
Yeah.
I've tried to make sure that the events on my book have had some online ones because obviously there's hopefully a group of readers that might be involved in or might be interested in reading the book because they either have chronic illness themselves or they're involved with somebody who does. And so the access was important to me to have at least,
Mm.
2 or 3 events that are accessible to anybody wherever they are. So I've had a few
Yeah.
of those. This podcast is another example of that as well. So I've tried to have a mix for people so it makes it as accessible as it can be.
Yeah, definitely. I was wondering whether that I might see you as an option on one of my mailing lists because I get the Staffordshire Wildlife Trust mailing
Oh,
list and we're a
okay.
member of Cheshire as
Right.
well.
Okay.
So yeah, just wondering if you might pop up on the mailing list at some point there. But
Well,
yeah,
I'm open to it if they're interested in online stuff. Obviously, I wouldn't be able to do it in person quite as easily,
mm,
but
yeah, well, you're too far away, aren't you, really,
mm,
for that? Yeah. So facing, as you've mentioned, and your book is about a lot of this chronic illness yourself in your 40s and being diagnosed. How would you sort of say that people that having low energy levels that you've mentioned, having a chronic illness, something that's going to keep them inside a little bit more, they're not going to be able to go on hikes or walking or access those green spaces, but certainly the ones that are forests and woods, which are hills, difficult to access and also for mobility issues as well. What would you say are some easy steps that people could take to just bring a little bit more nature into their life in other ways?
I suppose if you have a garden or if you have, an area for pots, then, that's, in fact, I did a whole load of articles in the Gardener's World magazine over the last 6 months, which were on a topic called Make a Meter Matter, which was their environmental kind of
Make
topic.
a meter map, you mean as in a
Make a
distance?
meter matter.
Okay.
So a square meter, and each of the 6 features was about a different way of making a meter matter. So if you've got a small garden, but you want to do something for wildlife or the environment, and it was a mix of things like a little pond, it was pollinator plants, but I went to the kind of scientific papers to really pick out the best in that space and to try and make sure that there was a mix of things, that you could have some climbers, that you'd have some annuals, that they'd access a mixture of insects, but not just the adult forms, also the caterpillars, the larval forms, that they would go through the different seasons, all those kind of things to try and get as many and as much, decent pollination and food plantage in a very small area. There was one on growing salads, which is more about, having less plastic and things like that. So that sort of thing outside. And there's lots of material written by lots of people on what you can do in a very small space or what you could do in a window box. Lots of online content to help you with that. And that's brilliant because that brings things to you, so if you can't get out very far, but you can go and sit in the garden or you can sit by I've got a window seat downstairs in our kind of in a bay window in our lounge, which is something I'd always wanted from being a child and eventually managed to get one. And that's lovely because I sit there and you're inside, but you are outside at the same
Yeah.
time because everything's around you. It's got lavender by there, so the bees come. So that's, if you're able to do that, that's great. If you're only in bed, then bringing things up to bed is really important. And we talked about senses. I didn't realise until 2 or 3 years ago how, for me anyway, how underused my sense of smell is when I'm in bed for a period of time, because the air tends to get quite stale. I mean, I have the
Mm.
window open often, but it sometimes doesn't make that much difference. And I think feel like I end up with quite a sensory underwhelm, really,
Yeah.
a lack of sensory stimulation in terms of smell. So, bringing up a mint leaf or bringing up some lavender from the garden or having some, essential oil or something, I think it just helps, for me, helps bring in some of those smells because I was going out after being in bed perhaps for several weeks, going outside and thinking, my goodness, there are smells here,
Yeah.
and then I thought, oh, well, that means I've not really been, having any smells. So that kind of sensory thing. There's a lovely book by a lady called Elizabeth Tover Bailey, which came out in 2010, I think, was just been
Oh,
reissued.
okay.
And that's her story of, I think she has ME and CFS and other things as well. Was really very poorly and still, I think, lives with chronic illness. And she talks about one period where she was really very ill and she was in bed for quite a period of time, very really unable to sort of move even a lot of the time. But her friend bought her a pot plant and it had a snail in it, and it's the
Oh,
story of the snail, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's beautifully written. It's really sparse in terms of its language, really on the button, I think. Yeah, I definitely recommend that for anybody. So
yeah.
I mean, reading if you can, or audio books. And then the other thing is bird songs, if you've got the window open, and using the Merlin app, which is a fantastic
Yes.
app to identify bird songs. So this morning I was lying in bed, I'd just woken up, and I could tell there were goldfinches had just flown over because I can hear the little bell calls. And, if you start to pick out that sort of thing, it just helps you, it's company, I suppose, in a way.
Mm.
I might not have talked to anybody in that period, but if I've been in bed all day by myself, if I knew the goldfinches had passed over, and I've had a black cat, which I've just written about for my country diary for next week, that's been singing outside my window. It's quite late in the season. And, last few days I've been quite tired because I've done quite a lot of book events. And the fact that, he'd spend half an hour in the morning, he'd be singing out there, was just a real connection to
Yeah.
wilder spaces that I wasn't at that point able to get to. So I think all of that
Mm.
sort of stuff. And then I'm trying to think, oh, I have got it here. If you are able to get out for walks, but only kind of locally, that's a fantastic book about
Urban
urban
plants.
plants that Trevor
Mm.
Dines brought out. So pavement plants, if you're able to go for a walk down to the shop or whatever. And I think once you notice them and once you realise, providing they're not all sprayed off, once you realise what little colonies of things there are around, again, that's a sort of, I almost find plants a companion. I'll say, oh,
Mm.
that's where the so and so grows, and oh, look, it's still there, or it's in flower, or it's gone into seed,
Yeah.
or maybe there's something interesting settled on it, or it's just all these little micro moments of noticing things that, for me anyway, helps bed me into the landscape and make me feel that when I can't go very far and I'm not seeing very many people, I am still surrounded by companions. So, I don't know, it
Yeah.
might work for people.
Yeah, I agree. We've got a little patch of grass at the back here. My partner mowed it last night, but in the spring, especially when everything's seeding and growing, we've had tiny little daisies there and dandelions as well, but all sorts of different, really tiny little
Mm.
flowers. And I find myself spotting one and going, "Oh, hello," and
Yeah, I do
talking
the
to
same.
it.
Absolutely. Yeah, nod my head sometimes to things, to
Yeah,
acknowledge them. Yeah, and talk to
yeah.
stuff all the time. Absolutely. Sorry, the other thing is if you draw, even if you're not very good at it, as I'm not, then if you're drawing a flower, for example, you're having to sit still for quite a period of time. You're going to have to really look at that, look at the way it's
Yeah.
constructed. That's a great way to learn about plants and to sort of, focus your attention. Or of course you can do it, if you're don't want to draw, or you're not up to drawing, you don't actually have to do the drawing bit. But that same kind of focus of attention that one might have if you were trying to replicate the curve of the petal or,
Yeah.
whatever. I think we hugely underestimate in our society the value of sitting in one place and looking at something for an extended period of time and seeing where that takes you.
I agree, that act of slowing down and just really honing in on something. I was looking at a garden book the other day at Neil's parents and the variety of plants, and in particular, there was this page. So I always know what a foxglove is. But there was a lot of similar plants that were very purple, some a little bit more wispy, some smaller. And I was thinking, I really need to get to know the difference, but can only really do that, I think, if I went outside and studied them outside. I don't think I'd get the same, it wouldn't impact my memory quite the same just from looking at the pictures in a book. But if I was able to take the book out and match them, and as you say, drawing them, because then there's that connection of the pen and the fingers with the brain, it kind of
Mm.
solidifying that memory a little bit more. Yeah, but it is just having that time, isn't it? But we do underestimate how powerful slowing down is. It
Yeah.
impacts our nervous system, slows our heart rate, reduces our anxiety. We could all benefit from a little bit more of that
And I
in
think if
life.
you're in a wild place, whether that's in the middle of a wood or whether that's, sat on your front doorstep, which can still be a wild place, and you do slow down, wildlife tends to come more, because
Mm,
you're sitting there and you're quiet and you're still. So actually things come to you, often really interesting things, if you give it a few minutes. The
sorry,
other
go
thing
on.
perhaps I just occurred to me is that quite often there are local wildlife groups around where you are,
Mm,
which often won't go for terribly long walks or, might sometimes go with the local British Naturalists Association and I just go for like an hour and then I come home and they carry on and do longer walks and stuff like that. So I love doing that sort of thing because quite often you're with people or a group of people who are all quite expert in different areas. But really, these groups of people are often really keen to get people involved and, really open and accessible and want to share knowledge. And that's a great way, is going out with somebody who knows a little bit more than you do, and
yeah.
because you pick bits up every time you do that. So, yeah.
Yeah. And even better with it being in your local area, because then you
Yeah.
can pass on that knowledge. Yeah, we have
Yeah.
got a similar organisation around here that they don't meet that often, actually. I wonder if that's just because there's not too many members. I did go to one of their meetings once, but it was cancelled. But they'd got no way of letting people know because there was no mailing list. But anyway, that's another story. But yeah, I think these little organisations, and sometimes we can find them through organisations like the Wildlife Trust or
Actually,
RSPB.
back of my book, I've got like a helpful section of websites that I found helpful. Quite a lot of them are to do with health and
Okay.
things. But the
Mm,
first section I did, because this is all about health, but also about the health of the wild landscape, I've kind of put the local connections, so not the RSPB, but the RSPB page where you can find your local group.
mm,
And butterfly conservation page where you can find your local group. Same for the bats, same for the mammals, and the conservation volunteers, which is a countrywide organisation that helps you get involved in conservation. And so and there'll be other ones. Most counties have their own natural history society, some of which might have then a flora society within that, or a bird society. And so there are plenty of things around, but it's just a case of knowing kind of where to look. And
mm.
if you find one person in one place, they'll often then help you by saying, "Oh, have you heard about this?" Or and I'm on quite a lot of WhatsApp groups, which
Yeah,
again could be nice. If you're inside and you're not doing much for a day or two, but people are sending, photos of things that they've seen. That's quite nice. Because you think, oh, okay, that's out there, and they often have a picture. So it's a
yeah.
way of connecting, even though you're not able to get there yourself.
Definitely, because there are studies, aren't there, that show that, when you look at things, then you do get similar things, happening
Mm,
within your body,
mm,
that are the same as being outside, maybe not quite as higher levels, but you're still
mm.
getting the benefit of seeing, the nature, the countryside, the landscape that you as being in there. Something else that I thought about when you were explaining about, bringing things up to the bedroom is, you can if you've got some photographs and things like that, or if in a WhatsApp group and people are sharing photographs, that you have these ways now of being able to print them off in small little sort of Polaroids almost that you
Mm,
could print
mm.
off and stick into a journal and just talk a little bit about how they make you feel, which is something else that I think
Yeah.
people could.
Well, my mum has one of the electronic photo frames, which I should probably
Mm,
send her photos to much more regularly than I do. But so, because obviously she's often in bed, she still lives with ME, CFS, and so yeah, so she you could have one of those, couldn't you? And then the stuff that came in, if you put it on there, would circle round and show you different
mm.
pictures of wildlife and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, and have a nice background soundtrack of nature sounds, the birds singing, the waterfalls flowing, all of that kind of thing. I mean, I quite often do that if I'm in the office all day. I'll choose a
Mm.
playlist that's either, focus work terminology, or it's just the sound of crashing waves by a boardwalk or something like that, or yeah, the bird
If you
song in the
if you've
morning.
got a screen I don't have a telly in my bedroom, but I know quite a lot of people do. You've got all of the live cams as well. So I was
Mm.
watching quite a lot of the peregrines on St Alban Cathedral live cam because a couple of years ago I volunteered with the Wildlife Trust and basically was accosting people as they walked past the cathedral and going, you don't want to go where you're going at the moment because you've got to come and see this really exciting bird in this telescope. And they kind of come over and they'd look and then almost all of them would go, wow, and then
Yeah,
beckon to the rest of their family and stuff like that. So I've been watching, there's loads of them, aren't there, around the UK? There's the osprey ones, there's puffin ones, there's all sorts of things that you can
mm.
kind of just have on in the background. And then you see when interesting things like, when they bring a half woodcock in to feed their chicks or whatever else is gruesomely
Yeah.
going on.
Yeah, just being able to turn those on and off whenever you want to, rather than waiting for something like Spring Watch that will broadcast it through to
Mm,
you, but then, carry
mm.
on and watch it, or just have it on as sound in the background. Yeah, you reminded me that I used to watch, there was a lady on Facebook that used to record, she had badgers that came into her back garden, and there was one particular one, and she used to share the footage all the time. This badger is passed now, but she still plays a lot of the footage that she got at night, and him, tapping his nose on the patio window and that kind of thing, which just brings a smile to your face.
I think it's probably very heavily connected to our DNA because if you think back, two, three generations, a couple of hundred years, whatever, we would have been in a situation where the majority of us, certainly my family, would have been working in the fields alongside the poet John Clare's family, for my family, for some of the branches. And, we would have set our internal clocks by all of these seasonal things, and we would have had the families of birds that we knew. And so what we're essentially doing there is bringing back a familiarity and a continuity, awareness, a kind of belonging, whatever you might call it, that we would have had. I mean, okay, we'd have been busy and we'd have been working hard and probably hungry, and we wouldn't have had time necessarily had time to sit down and watch the birds for a long period of time, but they would have been constants. These natural, organisms and landscapes in our lives, they would have been hugely important, though, in the background. And so I'm sure there's a part of us that kind of needs that.
Yeah. Yeah, that disconnect, unfortunately, which has gotten a little bit wider over the years. But yeah,
Mm,
innately we are nature, aren't we? Biophilia, the term, if we're
mm,
innately connected to everything. But yeah, I mean, even just you were talking there about being out in the fields, so just a couple of memories pop back in just from strawberry picking, and
mm,
that's a great way
mm,
to just get out with the family and
mm.
just go and pick a few
Yeah.
strawberries, and you can spend half a day doing that. You created the first Peat Free Nurseries list. So I just wanted to ask you a little bit about where that came from. How did that come about?
think I think I've always volunteered with, like my dad, I suppose, with natural history organisations. So I volunteered, probably 15 years ago with the RSPB up in the lodge at Sandy outside, and I volunteered with the Wildlife Trusts and all sorts of things like that. So kind of that's always been there. But this was just completely random, really. I suppose I was thinking about the fact I'd always been or for a long time been peat free in the garden, and the fact that when I buy in compost, as I'm sure many of us do, I make sure that it's peat free compost. If it doesn't say on the bag that it is, it won't be. But I realised one day that actually I wasn't peat free because the plants I was buying for my garden and for customers when I was doing clients when I was doing garden design obviously had been raised in peat. So I was like, hang on a minute, I'm not peat free. And I think we tend to think, or we did certainly tend to think of peat free as just being the bags of compost, and we didn't think about
Yeah.
what was in the plants. And so I started to try and source my plants from nurseries that grew them peat free. And it was really difficult. This was probably in about 2018, I suppose. I think I started the list in 2019. And I started to talk to colleagues at work and kind of say, have you been able to do this? And everybody was saying, no, we were finding it really difficult.
Mm.
And so while I was working at Gardeners World before COVID and before it all kind of went online, and now I work more from home, but I started compiling a list from what people had said of about, I suppose, about 6 or 8 initially nurseries that we knew were peat free. And as that grew over a year or so, I thought, actually, this is information that people might find useful because I couldn't find it. Other
Yeah.
people haven't been able to find it. So I put it online on my blog just as a sort of information thing. My blog's not monetized at all, so it's all done voluntarily. And it just was, people were needed that information. I think there was a niche that wasn't being filled.
Mm.
Obviously, over the last few years, as things have become more towards the peat free, although not as much as really they should have been from what, governmental intentions had been. We're still struggling a bit with that. But I added to it, and now it's got about 140 nurseries on it across the UK.
Wow.
And it's just been really popular, I think, because it's helped people. I know there are lots of people who go back to it every time they want plants to search. It's searchable. It's on my website, nicwilson.co.uk. So it's on there. And I think I don't know how many, it's certainly tens of thousands of people have accessed it,
Mm.
if not more. And it's been I wrote a bit for COP when it was up in Glasgow about it for them, and yeah, various things. But just I think because it's filled a niche, and actually the RHS now have got their own Peat Free Nurseries list, which they started about a year ago, which isn't quite as long as mine, but I imagine over time it'll
Mm.
certainly hit the search buttons because they're a bigger organisation. And that's fine. That eventually will take over and mine won't need to be updated anymore. The important thing to me is that the information's out there.
Yeah.
But I think for that period between 2009 sort of 2024, it was the only UK list. And so it was really
Yeah.
valuable to people who wanted to find those and hopefully supported the nurseries who were growing peat free, which, is everything down from Alison, who grows edible perennial vegetables in her back garden, up to the National Trust,
Mm.
seeds and things. So I just hope it's sort of helped people find stuff, supported the nurseries, and just given a little bit more of a push because the more people are talking about it, the more it's in the paper and COP stuff, and the more the public awareness is of how damaging peat is. I mean, I was involved in a campaign called Peat Free April, which was set up by gardeners and garden writers essentially about the same time, which we had a few years. It might still be running, but I'm not involved in it
Yeah, I
anymore.
was going to say, is that an
Trying to
annual?
push that. It
Yeah.
was, yeah, every
Mm.
April trying to push it. And Sarah Venn was one of the big instigators and activists in that. And sadly, she passed away
Yeah.
quite recently. So she's a huge loss to the community because she was amazing, one of the kindest and most principled people I'd ever met. So yeah, we need to keep going until we are completely peat free. And then of course the rest of the world, or many countries around the world still use peat. So it's a big issue. But
Issue, and hopefully
yeah.
more will follow. Yeah, it's one of
Mm.
those valuable resources that once somebody started it and then conversations continue and get wider and far far
Mm.
spread, then
Mm.
yeah, the more impact it's going to have to make some change. So
And lots of the
um
talks I do around in garden societies, that's one of the talks I do about sort of about peat and not just its, importance in terms of habitat, but also in terms of water services. So 70% of our water in the UK comes from peat catchments, and there's a lot of problems when they're
wow.
not in good
Mm.
health. And of course, carbon capture is the big one now. I
Mm.
think we've got more carbon stored in the UK's peat, resources than something like our woods and Germany and France's woods all put together. So, it's a massive
Mm.
underestimated, like seagrasses. There's lots of these and undeveloped grassland as well. Lots of carbon stores that we don't value the way we should.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't remember whether I mentioned to you beforehand that I did a bit of work for a video company that was doing some work for a company down on the south coast that was using seaweed in various places to trap the carbon, and
Okay.
it was a phenomenal percentage that it would
Mm,
trap, a lot more than a tree would.
mm,
And
mm.
hedgerows, but we don't know about these things, do we? Until the right people, come on board who've got the voice to be able to share it further and
Mm,
further. It's,
mm.
we've got to be kind of interested in that already and be able to do our own research. So it sort of takes the two more to combine a little bit more for it to really get
Yeah,
on, the
yeah. We need stories
everybody's.
about it. We need narratives about it that have
Mm,
hooks that people are interested in and that they remember. Yeah.
yeah, for sure. So What's the best way people can contact you, Nic, and where to get the book from and find out about some of your talks or some of the workshops? Where's the
Mhm.
best place for them to go?
Well, the kind of hub would be my website, nicwilson.co.uk. And the book is available, or I would urge you to get it from either an indie online bookshop or from bookshop.co.uk, is it? Bookshop.org, whichever the one is that supports the indies anyway. But then if you enjoy it, leave me a review on Amazon, please. But don't buy it from Amazon. Um, or go to your local indie. It's in a lot of the bookshops anyway and available on lots of places online. If there's anybody that's not in the UK, then Blackwell's, I think, does free delivery to the US pretty much everywhere, I think. So that's a good way because it's not actually out in the US yet or Canada or elsewhere as yet. Hopefully, might be in the future. And yeah, if you want to read my country diaries, if you Google Nic Wilson Guardian, you'll find those, particularly for anyone that's around this area. But though I'm one of 30 country diarists, so wherever you are in the UK, there'll probably be somebody that's fairly local to you. Lots of different voices, lots of different people with different interests and different sort of backgrounds, and yeah, so that's a really nice pick me up in the morning if you're, having a day where you want some so good news story. I mean, they're not always, because sometimes, when you write about the environment, it can't always be good news, but often it's about really interesting bits of information about plants and animals. And
Yeah,
yeah,
a
I guess
nice, easy way to get in, to dip your toes in and find out a little bit more.
absolutely, yeah, no, they're really
Mm.
good, and written in lots of different styles, which is nice as well. Some are quite lyrical, some are more scientific, depending on the person that's writing them and the subject. So yeah, I always enjoy it. I put those out on Blue Sky every day. I have been doing since the demise of X and the Guardian
Yeah.
stopped doing it. It used to do it on X. I think they've just got an environmental Guardian page up and running on Blue Skies. Anyway, just search for Nic Wilson and you find me on there.
Yeah.
Somehow I've got nearly 17,000 followers. I'm not quite sure how that happened.
Wow.
It's more
Brilliant.
than I've had anywhere else. I
Because of
think
all
I've
of the
got in quite
excellent
early.
work that you're doing, Nick, that's why.
It's certainly a lovely community. There's lots of nature organisations on there now. And there are things called starter packs. So if you're new to Blue Sky and you go on, it's like X used to be, but without the algorithms. But you can find the starter packs, you can search for those online, and there'll be a starter pack for like all the UK conservation societies and all the UK research into climate change, and probably one for butterflies. And so you can kind of find your tribe quite easily that way. And I run the nature writing and the life writing, what are called feeds. So you can choose, you have your ordinary feed, which is the people you follow, but there's no adverts or anything like that. So you don't get a load of rubbish that you don't want. And then you can choose your feeds. Either you can curate your own feed, or you can choose like to hop on my Guardian Country Diary feed or my life writing or nature writing. And I've just curated a list essentially. And so hopefully you'll get lots of posts about nature writing or lots of posts about life writing and memoir and stuff like that. So
Yeah, I'll check that out.
I'm still on Facebook and Instagram, but I don't do as much on there because I just get sent, you just get loads of stuff you're not interested in. Whereas Blue
Mm.
Sky is kind of, has ended up being my place really, where I enjoy it most because I just talk about butterflies a lot basically at the moment. Everybody
Yeah.
tells me stuff that's interesting about butterflies, and that's cool. I need a space
Yeah.
like
Definitely. It's like you say, finding your tribe, and that's
that.
where they are. So, you have
Mm.
to go to that space and it makes you happy. Brilliant. Well, I've thoroughly enjoyed talking to you this morning, Nic. Thank you so much for your time. Is there any kind of
Well,
takeaway or anything that you want to leave the listeners or the watchers with?
well, I would say at some point during the day when you've watched this, go out and just sit for a minute. Preferably, I would say, or for me, it would be on my front doorstep in the sunshine with a cup of tea. And then maybe something interesting will come and alight by your left foot and give you a little bit of a lift.
Yeah, sounds fabulous. A lovely place to end. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's Writing with Purpose podcast. Having conversations with fellow writers or adventure enthusiasts brings two of my biggest loves in life together, writing and nature connection. I've been a copywriter and content creator for 23 years, but my passion is writing for well-being, and I'm on a mission to share the benefits that putting pen to paper has for personal wellness with as many people as possible. If you want to learn more about writing for your well-being and journaling techniques, please connect with me in my Facebook group, Journaling with Anna.